Welcome to my channel. I'm Ben. Tonight, we step into a story of teenage friendship turned into betrayal, where trust among high school companions shattered in the most unthinkable way. It begins with a 17-year-old girl found in a roadside ditch, her body still warm, her shoes missing, and a silence hanging over the night. What happened in those final hours? And why was she left behind by those she thought were her friends? Let us begin. Ocklawaha, Florida, is the kind of quiet place where nights are supposed to be uneventful, where the hum of crickets fills the air and the sound of tires on asphalt is rare after dark. But on a cool evening in late March of 2023, that stillness was broken by a discovery that would haunt the entire community. 17-year-old Leila Silvernail was found along a roadside ditch, her body still warm when deputies arrived. She had been shot once, a single round that ended her life before the sun could rise again. Layla's story does not begin with violence. Only hours earlier, she had been riding in a Chevy Cruze with people she believed were her friends, people she had laughed with, confided in, and trusted. They were teenagers, like her faces familiar, bonds that felt unshakable in the fragile world of high school friendships. Yet somewhere between those hours of easy laughter and the ditch where she was abandoned, that trust collapsed. For investigators, the scene was stark. A girl barely out of childhood, her shoes missing, one discarded further down the road. The glow of patrol car lights painted the trees in red and blue, while neighbors stood at a distance, whispering questions they could not answer. Who could do this to someone so young? Why did it happen here, in their quiet corner of Florida? For Layla, though, the ending came even faster. In the silence between a familiar voice and the gunshot that followed, she lost everything: her chance to graduate, to chase the future she once imagined, to return home and tell her family she loved them. A promise half-spoken, maybe a laugh not yet finished, lingered as her final trace. This is not only the story of a crime, it is the story of trust betrayed, of a girl whose last moments remind us how fragile friendship can be, and how a single act of violence can silence a lifetime of possibility. Before her name became a headline, Leila Silvernail was a teenager navigating the ordinary chaos of growing up. She was 17, a girl caught between the innocence of high school days and the pull of adulthood that always seems just out of reach. France described her as energetic, someone who filled quiet spaces with laughter. She played softball, a sport that kept her grounded, teaching discipline, teamwork, and resilience. The field was where she often felt most herself, dirt on her cleats, and the Florida sun on her back, chasing small victories that made her feel limitless. Layla's circle was tight but vital. Among them were Mike Hodo Jr. and Camille Quarles, both close in age and part of the world that gave her a sense of belonging. With them, she shared rides, conversations that stretched late into the night, and the kind of teenage plans that always felt bigger than they really were. In that fragile world, bonds are currency and trust is given fully, because at 17, betrayal still feels impossible. Those who knew Layla recall her as someone who believed in people, maybe too much. She was quick to forget, quick to overlook faults, and quicker still to hope that others would show her the same kindness. It was part of what drew friends to her warmth, her willingness to make space for everyone. But it was also the very trait that made her vulnerable. When the people around her carried secrets or darker intentions, she was not the kind of person to see betrayal coming. Her family saw her as a girl on the cusp of so much possibility. She was supposed to graduate, to continue her path in sports, perhaps to go to college. There were plans for birthdays, road trips, and long summers still unwritten. In many ways, she embodied the restless hope of small-town youth, the idea that life was only just beginning and that no matter how modest the town, dreams could stretch beyond its borders. The tragedy of Layla's death is not only in how she was taken, but in who she was before it happened. A girl with friendships she believed in, a future she was chasing, and a heart open enough to trust those who would ultimately betray her. To understand her story, we have to see her not only as a victim, but as a teenager who carried all the normal hopes of her age and who, in trusting the wrong people, became caught in a betrayal too heavy for someone her age to bear. The night that began with laughter and the comfort of familiar company turned into something Layla could never have imagined. It started with the Chevy Cruze, a car that had carried so many teenagers through Florida's back roads, a place of shared secrets and fleeting moments of freedom. Layla climbed in with trust. Mike Hodo Jr. was there. Camille Quarles was there, and so were the boys she considered part of her wider circle faces. She knew people she thought would never hurt her. In her mind, this was another night of riding around, talking, and maybe making plans for the weekend. Nothing about it suggested danger, but somewhere along the ride, the air changed. The comfort of friendship began to mask a darker plan. Investigators later revealed that a plot had been set in motion, one that Layla herself could not have anticipated. She was not entering a night of carefree companionship. She was stepping into a trap. Layla's final hours unfolded in fragments, pieces that were later reconstructed by detectives and prosecutors. What they found was chilling. Within that Chevy Cruze, she was shot once, a close-range execution that contradicted every instinct of loyalty she carried. The betrayal was absolute. She had trusted these people enough to get in the car, to share her time, and to laugh with them. Only moments before then, in the blink of an eye, she became the first victim. After the shot, Layla's body was dragged from the car and abandoned by the roadside ditch in Ocklawaha. The Florida night, once filled with the hum of insects, now bore silent witness to a girl discarded by those she had once called friends. Her shoes were missing, one later found farther down the road, a haunting detail that seemed to underline how violently her life had been torn from her. The crime did not end with Layla. Michael Hodo Jr., 16 years old, would be next. Hours after Layla was left in the ditch, his body was discovered lying on the side of another road, a single gunshot wound marking his end. Then came Camille Quarles, also 16. She was left inside the very car that had carried all three of them. The Chevy Cruze was found partially submerged in a pond, Camille's body still inside. The vehicle that once represented freedom for these friends had become a coffin. 3 teenagers, 3 single gunshots, 3 lives ended within the span of days. The pattern was too precise to be random, too calculated to be impulsive. For law enforcement, it was clear that these were not accidents, they were executions, carried out with the coldness of someone determined to silence those who had once shared their trust. For Layla, the horror is in how quickly the night shifted. She might have thought they were stopping to grab food or to drive to another friend's house. She could have believed the night was still young, that they had time to linger on back roads before heading home. Instead, the very people beside her had already decided she would not live to see morning. That betrayal is the heart of the crime. Layla's death was not just the result of violence. It was the unraveling of the belief that her friends cared for her. In her last moments, she may not have even had time to register that trust had turned against her. But in the quiet ditch where she was left, the truth stood stark. The people she trusted most had chosen to end her life. From the moment deputies discovered Leila Silvernail's body, investigators knew this was not an accident or a random act. A 17-year-old left on the side of the road, shot once, pointed to something deliberate, but the true scale of the case became clear only when, within days, Michael Hodo Jr. and Camille Quarles were also found dead. 3 teenagers, each killed with a single shot, each connected to the same small circle of friends. It was no longer just a tragedy. It was a pattern. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the Marion County Sheriff's Office moved quickly. Their first priority was to piece together the timeline. They collected phone records, examined digital communications, and tracked cell tower data. Each ping told a story. The teens' phones placed them together. Traveling across rural roads that night, investigators could trace their movements, building a digital map of betrayal. Social media added another layer. Direct messages, Snapchat exchanges, and Instagram posts became evidence. Detectives discovered conversations that hinted at tension, arguments, and threats. In one chilling message, later cited in court, the language was blunt and merciless, suggesting that crossing the wrong person would have consequences. These weren't idle words between restless teenagers. They were precursors to violence. Physical evidence tied the case even tighter. The Chevy Cruze itself became a moving crime scene. Inside, forensic teams found blood and ballistic traces. The car's partial submersion in a pond did not erase what investigators needed. Shell casings, DNA, and fingerprints connected the victims and suspects in ways that were impossible to deny. Within days, law enforcement announced arrests. Christopher Atkins, just 12 years old, and Robert Robinson, 17, were taken into custody. A third suspect, 16-year-old Taj Bruton, was also identified and arrested later. The ages of the accused shocked the public as much as the crimes themselves. How could children, barely teenagers, carry out killings so cold and calculated? The charges were severe. Each suspect faced counts of first-degree murder, along with conspiracy and weapons charges. Prosecutors emphasized that these were not spontaneous acts, but planned executions. Sheriff Billy Woods described the killings as a mission, a phrase that captured the deliberate nature of the crimes. For Layla's family, the arrests were both a relief and another wave of grief. Knowing that those responsible were behind bars could not erase the image of their daughter lying in a ditch. For the community, the revelation was a blow. The killers were not faceless predators from outside, but children from within their own neighborhoods, kids who had shared the same schools and sidewalk. The investigation's speed and precision highlighted the reality of modern crime solving. Cell phone data, social media footprints, and digital surveillance formed the backbone of the case. But beneath the technology was something more human: betrayal among friends. Decisions made in whispers that ended with 3 young lives. Silenced, by the time the suspects stood before a judge, the charges against them painted a picture that no parent or neighbor wanted to believe. These were not accidents of youth. These were deliberate choices carried out with chilling finality. For Layla, Michael, and Camille, the investigation revealed the truth. They never had the chance to tell that trust had been weaponized against them, and justice would now have to speak in their place. When the case finally reached the courtroom, it was no longer just about evidence and timelines. It became about voices. Voices of prosecutors, defense attorneys, and most powerfully, the families of the victims. For Leila Silvernail, her presence in the trial was carried by the words of her loved ones, who stood before the judge and jury to make sure she was not reduced to a file number or a forensic report. The defendants, Christopher Atkins, barely 12 years old, Robert Robinson, 17, and Taj Bruton, 16, sat before the court as prosecutors laid out their narrative. They were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy, and weapons violations. Prosecutors emphasized that the killings were not accidents or spur-of-the-moment decisions. Sheriff Billy Woods' description: "This was a mission," echoed in the courtroom. Underscoring the deliberate nature of the crimes, the trial highlighted the surreal nature of the case. Children standing accused of killing their peers. Jurors listened as detectives explained how digital trails of cell phone pings and social media messages linked the suspects to the murders. Forensic experts walked them through the physical evidence recovered from the Chevy Cruze. Each detail reinforced the idea that this was not a chaotic burst of violence, but a sequence of calculated acts. But the most powerful moments came from the families. Layla's relatives described her dreams, her kindness, her laughter. They spoke of birthdays that would never come, and of an empty seat at the dinner table. Their words turned the abstract horror of 3 victims back into human lives. When Layla's name was spoken in court, it was not as a case number, but as a daughter, a sister, a teammate, a girl whose life had meaning. The defense faced an uphill battle. Christopher Atkins' age drew attention, just 12 years old at the time of the murders. His attorneys argued that someone so young could not fully understand the magnitude of his actions, raising questions about culpability and the influence of older peers. For Robert Robinson and Taj Bruton, defense strategies leaned on trying to separate intent from outcome, suggesting that peer pressure and immaturity blurred the line between planning and acting. Yet, for the jury and for the families, the arguments could not erase the facts. 3 teenagers were dead, each killed by someone they trusted. Whatever the nuances of age and influence, the outcome was the same. The courtroom became a space where grief met accountability, where the final words of families carried the weight that Layla and the others could no longer speak. When the verdicts were read and sentences delivered decades in prison, with the possibility of review after 25 years, the families wept. Relief mingled with heartbreak. Justice had spoken, but it could never give back what was lost. For Layla's loved ones, the trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a final act of witness, a chance to stand in her place and make sure her voice was heard. To understand the weight of what happened to Leila Silvernail and her friends, investigators and psychologists alike turned to the minds of those who carried out the killings. How could children barely into their teens commit acts so precise, so deliberate, and so cold? The question haunted the courtroom and the community alike. At the center was the idea of control. Forensic psychologists later described the behavior as rooted in dominance, the need to dictate the terms of relationships, and to punish anyone who challenged that authority. The messages recovered from phones and social media revealed an unsettling mindset. If they cross me, they die. This was not impulsive bravado. It was a declaration of ownership over life and death, uttered by someone too young to drive, yet determined to play God with peers. Control, in this case, meant turning friendship into currency. Those accused were not outsiders. They were part of the same circle of laughter, sports, and weekend rides. By orchestrating the murders, they weaponized trust. To betray someone like Layla, who believed in kindness and forgiveness, was not only violence, but psychological domination. It was proof in their minds that they could decide who lived and who did not. Experts pointed out that adolescence is already a volatile time. The brain's prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse control and long-term judgment, is not fully developed until the mid-20s, yet immaturity alone could not explain the calculated nature of these killings. This was not a case of sudden rage or reckless play. It was planned, rehearsed in messages, and carried out with chilling efficiency. That distinction forced experts to acknowledge something darker, the possibility of emerging antisocial traits, the capacity for cruelty, untempered by empathy. Layla's case became a tragic illustration of how quickly group dynamics can warp in adolescence. Peer pressure is powerful, and loyalty to the wrong leader can override conscience. Prosecutors argued that one suspect, older and more dominant, acted as the architect, while the younger ones followed, swept into a spiral where violence became proof of allegiance. In that spiral, Layla was not seen as a friend or teammate, but as a liability to be erased. For the community, the psychological questions deepened the horror. Parents wondered how children in their own neighborhoods could harbor such darkness. Teachers asked whether warning signs had been missed. Some pointed to broken homes, exposure to violence, or the absence of strong parental guidance. Others warned against simple explanations. Plenty of children face hardship without becoming killers. What marked these suspects was not just their environment, but the choices they embraced within it. Psychologists emphasized one final point: the murders stripped away empathy. To leave Layla in a ditch, to discard Michael on the roadside, to submerge Camille in a car, required not only action, but the denial of humanity. It was not enough to pull a trigger. It demanded shutting down the natural response to another's suffering. That, experts argued, is the chilling element. The crimes were not only physical, they were emotional voids, acts of people who, at least in those moments, refused to see their victims as human. For Layla, the tragedy is doubled. She was a girl who gave trust freely, who believed in forgiveness, and who lived with an open heart. Against that, she met individuals who valued control above compassion. Her death became the intersection of two forces: the vulnerability of youthful trust and the brutality of youthful cruelty. It is a reminder that even in adolescence, choices carry the weight of life and death. In the weeks and months after the murders, Ocklawaha was not the same. The quiet Florida town that once measured its nights by the sound of cicadas now carried the echo of 3 lost teenagers. Roadside memorials appeared, where their bodies were found, flowers wilting in the sun, candles burned down to stubs, photos taped to trees that swayed in the evening breeze. For Leila Silvernail, the ditch where she was discovered became both a place of grief and of remembrance. Friends left softball gloves, handwritten notes, and bracelets, small tokens of a life that ended too soon. The community struggled to reconcile the horror. Parents found themselves looking differently at their children's friendships, suddenly alert to warning signs they might have overlooked. Teachers spoke of the shock of seeing students accused of crimes so grave, grappling with how to discuss the tragedy in classrooms. Church leaders organized vigils, urging healing, but also asking questions that had no easy answers. How could trust collapse so completely? And how could children become killers? For Layla's family, every milestone that passed without her graduation ceremonies, holidays, birthdays was a reminder of the future she would never see. Her seat on the softball team remained empty, her absence marked by the silence where cheers used to be. They spoke publicly of her kindness and her dreams, determined that people remember not only how she died, but how she lived. National media briefly turned its attention to Ocklawaha, framing the story as both tragedy and cautionary tale. Commentators debated the role of social media, peer influence, and juvenile justice. Could a 12-year-old truly understand the permanence of pulling a trigger? Should the law treat him the same as older co-defendants? These questions sparked heated discussions, but for the family, the debates could never touch the raw truth. Layla, Michael, and Camille were gone. In the end, the aftermath of Layla's death left a scar deeper than a headline. It was written in the tearful vigils, in the empty spaces at family tables, and in the eyes of a town that could no longer claim innocence. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but in Ocklawaha, the community continued to live with the reminder that betrayal had happened among them, and that even the bonds of youth could be shattered in a single night. For Layla, her story became a warning and a legacy, a reminder of trust broken, but also of a life that mattered enough for so many to grieve. The story of Leila Silvernail is more than a tragic crime. It is a stark reminder of how fragile trust can be, even among friends we believe will never betray us. At 17, Layla was full of hope, laughter, and dreams for the future. Yet in a single night, everything she believed in was shattered. This case forces us to confront a painful truth. Sometimes the greatest danger does not come from strangers on dark streets, but from the people sitting right beside us. For parents and communities, it's an urgent question. How do we recognize warning signs among teenagers who seem ordinary on the surface? How do we balance the innocence of youth with the reality that some choices carry permanent consequences? And for young viewers, it is a reminder to value the friendships that lift you up while staying cautious of those that pull you into harm's way. Now, I'd like to hear your perspective. What do you think this case tells us about trust, loyalty, and the choices young people face today? Please share your thoughts in the comments. I read them carefully, and they bring new insight to these stories. If you found this episode meaningful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more true crime documentaries. Your support helps keep these stories alive.